They tore down the bridge while Uncle Hank was still on it. That Tabose. That's not a metaphor. It wasn't dream, no, it was real as the taste of Earl Grey and the weight of 75 winters behind your eyes. I saw it with my own, too. Pulled up just in time to witness it all unfold like the beginning of war that nobody thought would come home. He was standing dead center on that bridge, calm as Monk and Hurricane. He wore his usual plaid pajama pants, yellow law hoodie, a size too big slippers worn at the toes, and a mug in hand like it was some sacred relic. The rising sun threw streaks of gold over the creek. Birds chirped in ignorant cheer. Meanwhile, 10 feet away, a rented bulldozer growled its engine coughing smoke like it had something to prove. The foreman yelled over the rumble, unsure whether to laugh or panic. Sir, please, you need to vacate the structure. But Uncle Hank didn't flinch, not breath out of place. He sipped his tea. Son, he said, this bridge has outlasted 2 wars, 3 hurricanes, and 5 HOAs. I laid half of it myself with stones hauled from Revolutionary War quarry. I won't move just because some suburban warlord with clipboard and an unearned sense of purpose decided she doesn't like the aesthetic. Then came the metal scream. The bulldozer shifted into gear, backed up, and charged like tank through the side beam, wood cracked like bones. I opened my car door without turning off the ignition and sprinted like I was chasing ghosts. Hank, but he didn't even run. Just took one last sip, set his mug gently on the railing, and stepped off the bridge like he was exiting a Broadway stage. The whole thing collapsed behind him in a slow-motion wave of timber, heritage, and insult. He looked at me with a wry grin and said, they just declared war on the wrong federal judge. That's where it started, or maybe that's just where I entered the story. The thing is, this wasn't just about bridge. You know that feeling when the world starts running on a new set of rules and you wake up realizing no one told you? Maybe it's a new street sign on road you've driven every day for decades. Maybe it's some kid telling you you can't plant tomatoes in your own damn yard anymore because rulebook you never voted on says so. That's the vibe here. That's what this really was. A few months before that demolition day, new HOA board took over the sleepy little community next to Hank's land. They gave themselves a name, the Neighborhood Harmony Council. Sounds harmless, right? Sounds like bake sales and dog park newsletters, except the first thing they did was weaponize their position like a toddler with a badge. Fines flew out like confetti. One neighbor got cited for having more than 3 garden gnomes. Another was told her bird feeder encouraged wildlife loitering. I wish I was joking, but their favorite target was the bridge. Now let me tell you something about that bridge. It wasn't just pile of wood and nails. It was the kind of thing that carried memories in its grain. Hank had spent years restoring it, stone by stone, beam by beam. It sat at the far edge of his property, spanning the creek that had marked the land's boundary since before this country was even called country. It wasn't in HOA jurisdiction, not by any legal stretch, but legality doesn't matter much when someone's on power trip and no one's pushing back. The president of the HOA, a woman named Kina, was the sort who printed her own business cards for an unpaid position and walked around like every hedge was a federal matter. She once called animal control on a neighbor's cat for looking at her suspiciously. She decided the bridge was blight, claimed it ruined the visual flow of the neighborhood, tried to cite codes it didn't fall under, invented snake infestation. I mean snakes, for God's. Hank responded with a 3-page letter that danced through federal heritage protections, municipal easement law, and a closing paragraph that read like the kind of thing that makes grown attorneys sweat in silence. Kina replied by slapping a bright orange sticker on the bridge that said scheduled for removal, HOA compliance required. Hank peeled it off and mailed it back with a note, return to sender, unlawful nonsense. Now most people would have called it there, would have thought she'd give up, realized she'd barked up the wrong legal tree. But see, Kina didn't just want control, she wanted obedience. That's where she made her mistake. She escalated, sent letters with phrases like deliberate noncompliance with neighborhood beautification goals and endangering communal visual peace. One of them claimed the bridge posed national security threat due to outdated construction materials. We laughed for a full 10 minutes over that one. Then came the forged demolition order, looked official, had seals, fake signatures, the works. But Hank saw through it like a written in crayon. He'd called the county, confirmed it was fake. They said no such request had ever been submitted by the HOA. So we thought bluff call. Unindusted, we underestimated her the morning of the demolition. I was headed up for the weekend, past a convoy of construction trucks on the highway. At first, I figured it was road work. Then I saw their path, straight for the creek. My stomach dropped. When I got there, it was too late. The bridge was already cracking. Kina stood on the bank with latte in one hand and her phone in the other, live streaming like she was queen of progress. You're welcome, she said, me smirking. Your uncle can use the main road now. Like a normal person. That's when Hank emerged from the house, calm, in control, holding leather folder He handed her a federal injunction he'd pre-written, because of course he had, and said, "You may want to retain legal counsel, preferably someone familiar with felony vandalism and federal property law." She laughed, waved the papers like coupons. "Oh, please, this was community improvement effort." He tilted his head, not angry, just disappointed. "Ma'am, you didn't just mess with Bridge. You messed with me. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When did we get so comfortable being pushed around? When did it become acceptable for someone with clipboard and an empty title to rewrite the laws that bind us, the heritage that defines us, and the property we've poured our blood and time into? Because it didn't used to be like this. Men like Hank, hell, men like you, if you're over 60 and lived through some real history, they don't fold easy. They don't throw away what's sacred just because newsletters said so. And they sure as hell don't step aside when fake order rolls in. What happened that morning wasn't just about Bridge. It was about bigger fracture. One between citizens and the systems that are supposed to serve them, between heritage and hubris, between earned wisdom and shallow power. And maybe you felt it too, that slow encroachment, that quiet erasure of control over what's yours. Maybe it wasn't Bridge for you. Maybe it was your backyard, your front porch, your way of life. Maybe someone knocked once, smiled fake, and told you there's a new rule now. And maybe you thought that's just how it is these days, but maybe, just maybe, something inside you stirred that morning watching Hank stand there as the dust settled and Keena clicked. And live, something stirred in me too. Not just anger, not even rage, but recognition. We've forgotten that bridges like the one Hank built don't just span creeks, they span generations. They carry memory, dignity, resistance. They're built by hands that know what work is, by men who fought not just in wars, but in boardrooms and courtrooms and town halls. That bridge, his bridge, wasn't just timber, it was testimony. And when they brought it down, they started something they couldn't stop, because Hank wasn't done. And neither, I think, are we. The wreckage still lay smoking at the edge of the creek the next morning like the corpse of something noble that had been ambushed in the night. You'd think there'd be some kind of decency, some pause for reflection after you destroyed a piece of someone's history. But no, Keena in her ever-crisp blazer and sanctimonious stride had already updated HOA Facebook group with photos of the bulldozed bridge under the caption, "Visual obstruction removed. Immunity standards restored." One of the comments said finally, "That eyesore is gone." When others said, "It's just Bridge, get over it." They didn't understand, they couldn't, because it's never just Bridge, and it's never just rule. It's what those things stand for. When people who've never built anything decide they have the right to tear it all down. Hank didn't say much at breakfast. He sat at the old oak table like he always did, mug in hand, newspaper folded but untouched. But there was a different kind of silence in the room. Not the kind that comes from sorrow, but the kind that comes before the strike. He'd always been deliberate like that. He used to say, the loudest man in the courtroom is usually the one losing. So he sat still, sorting documents with the same precision he once used dissecting corruption cases from behind the bench. But you could feel it, the wires tightening, the gears moving. Something was coming. Morning, he handed me a list written in careful penmanship. At the top it said, "Priority witnesses," and beneath that, in alphabetical order, were names I recognized. Mitchell from the construction crew, the clerk from county records, the preservation officer whose voicemail still hadn't been returned. I raised an eyebrow and asked, "We going full courthouse already?" Hank didn't look up. "We're not going to court," he said. "We're bringing it to him." He made the calls. In the background, the printer hummed like battle hymn, scans, copies, annotated notes. He had folder for everything. Folder for falsified permits. Folder for state registry documents. Folder for HOA bylaws with highlighted sections that Keena had clearly violated. Another for internal communications between HOA board members, at least the ones who hadn't deleted their emails yet. He'd even started drafting letters. Formal notices, citizen complaints, ethics board referrals. It was like watching an orchestra come together, except every instrument was tuned to vengeance and every note sang of restoration. Meanwhile, I drove to speak with one of the neighbors, Isis Langston. She'd been around longer than the HOA, longer than the bridge even. She met her husband there, she told me once, on the 4th of July, when the town still held parades and lit fireworks above the creek. Now her window looked out on nothing but splinters and caution tape. That bridge raised more children than that HOA's ever managed. She said, her voice dry but fierce. I asked if she'd be willing to give statement. "Well, honey," she said, "I'd testify before Congress if it meant putting that woman in her place." Back at the house, Hank had already logged the first official complaint to the State Historical Preservation Office. He wasn't just filing paper. He was stacking dominoes. One tapped, and the lion would fall. But what struck me wasn't the speed or the strategy. It was the calm. There was no flailing, no ranting, just this terrifying steadiness, the kind that comes from a man who's been underestimated before and came out on top anyway. That afternoon, Keena showed up unannounced. No hoe badge this time, just face of false concern. She stood on Hank's porch with her arms crossed like she was the one wrong. Judge Havorson, she began, but I think this has all been blown out of proportion. He didn't invite her in. He didn't even offer chair. He simply asked which part, the unlawful demolition, the forged documents, or the trespass on private property. She blinked, tried to wave it off. Look, no one wants lawsuit. This could be settled internally. Hank leaned against the doorframe. This was never internally. His pen, well, you made it public the moment you posted your little live stream. Now it'll stay public. And that's when it clicked. She thought she could talk her way out of this the same way she got into power. Through confidence, manipulation, and selective memory. But she didn't realize she was standing across from a man who'd once unseated corrupt mayor with 3-hour deposition and single phone call. She underestimated the damage. Worse, she underestimated the resolve. 2 days later, the first article hit the local news. Retired federal judge threatens lawsuit after historic demolished by HOA. Hank hadn't spoken to reporters, but someone had leaked enough details to start the fire. By the end of the week, 3 more outlets had picked it up. They used words like community outrage and misuse of authority, and the comments online started turning. Where once the HOA had defenders, now came the questions. Did they really have permission? Wasn't that bridge on federal land? Isn't Havorson that judge who took down the pharmaceutical lobbyist? You could almost hear the shift. Then came Mitchell, the contractor who drove the bulldozer. He showed up after dark, nervous, hat in hand. I didn't know, sir, he said. We were told it was nuisance structure. Said you were out of town. Hank didn't raise his voice. He offered the man lemonade, asked him to sit, and by the end of that conversation, we had something more valuable than any document. Confession, handwritten, signed, and accompanied by copy of the work order with Keena's notes still scribbled in the margins. One line read, "Do it fast. We don't want the state involved." We didn't need courtroom. Not yet. We needed momentum. So Hank drafted an open letter to the neighborhood, sent it in hard copy. Printed, signed, mailed it home. It wasn't angry. It was precise. It laid out the facts, the bridge's protected status, the lack of permits, the falsified claims. And at the end, in bolded, asked one simple question. If this is how they treat what's not theirs, what happens when it's yours next? That was the spark. Suddenly, people who had stayed quiet began to speak up. Man on the board resigned, citing serious ethical concerns. A woman down the street posted that her garden had been threatened last fall over non-standard flower pot. And the whole Facebook grew. Well, let's just say it stopped being fan club and started sounding more like deposition. Of course, Keena tried to push back. She hosted community meeting in the clubhouse, tried to spin the story. Called Hank resistant to progress, claimed the bridge was unsafe, cited unspecified threats. But the crowd wasn't buying it. One man stood up and said, "Unsafe. I kid used to fish from that bridge. My wife painted it for our anniversary." Another asked flat out, "Where's the permit, Keena?" She had no answer. Just a deflection and a nervous glance toward her clipboard as if it could save her, but a clipboard's not sword. And this wasn't her court anymore. Later that week, Hank received cease and desist letter clearly drafted in haste by some bargain bin legal advisor. It accused him of defamation, harassment, incitement. He read it aloud while stirring his tea and laughed. "They really think paperwork scares me." Then he turned to me and said, "Let's give them something to really file about." So he did. He finalized the civil suit, filed it under federal statute just to make the jurisdiction clear. Property destruction, fraud, trespassing, abuse of authority. He included a personal claim too, emotional distress, not for money but for punctuation. And that's when the real silence fell, not the silence of defeat, the silence of waiting, the kind that settles over field before storm, the kind you feel when you know you've done everything right and now it's the other side's turn to run. But this wasn't just about winning, not for Hank and not for me either. This was about reminding people, maybe people like you, that there's still power in principle, that respect isn't granted by titles or name tags or HOA newsletters. It's earned through action, through legacy, through bridges, literal and otherwise, that we choose to build and protect. And once you tear one down without asking, well, you better be damn sure who's watching. It started with the mailbox. That's how you know war is about to get personal. When the paper doesn't come quietly. A week after the lawsuit was filed, Hank received a certified letter wrapped in legal language so dense it could have stopped bullet. But he opened it with the same indifference he might show to grocery receipt. The letter was from Keena's new attorney, local figure named Brock Lansing. The name sounded like it belonged to an used car dealership rather than a law office. His business card, if you can call it that, featured a photo of himself in sunglasses and a slogan that read, "The legal hammer, when justice needs muscle." Hank smirked, then dropped the card into the fireplace. "Justice doesn't need muscle," he muttered. "It needs memory." From that day forward, things didn't just escalate. They spiraled. The whole board, once smugly silent, now found themselves dodging questions from reporters, residents, and an increasing number of state officials. They called for an emergency meeting, not to admit guilt or apologize, but to discuss allocating HOA funds toward Keena's legal defense. And that, my friend, was the moment the neighborhood turned. Not everyone speaks the language of legal briefs and land use codes, but everyone understands one simple truth. Your dues aren't supposed to fund someone else's mistake, especially not when that mistake involves backhoe a nationally registered landmark. Mr. Langston, who normally limited his opinions to weather and football, stood up during the meeting. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with fury. "I paid $400 last year to receive the tennis court," he said. "Not to dig Keena out of legal grave she built herself." The room went quiet, and then came the murmurs. Someone else muttered, "When did we even vote her in?" And just like that, the seat of doubt grew legs. People started whispering about the last election, how the former president had resigned abruptly, how Keena ran unopposed after accusing two candidates of violating obscure Rule 14C about seasonal REIT sizes. It wasn't just gossip. Hank, in his methodical brilliance, had already filed requests to inspect the HOA's internal voting records. Turns out they hadn't been properly documented in 2 years. The minutes from their last 3 meetings were either missing or mysteriously edited. Worse, one of the signatures approving Keena's presidency had been traced back to homeowner who'd moved out 2 years prior. Hank held the document up to the light like curator studying forgery. "She's been rigging the game since the first move," he said. "Classic clipboard coup." Now you may be wondering, county in all this, where were the regulators, the code enforcers, the people we pay taxes to so that the rule of law means something? The answer is complicated. Some of them were embarrassed, some were quietly rooting for Hank, and some, well, they were just waiting to see how hard the hammer would fall. But not everyone stood on the sidelines. One particular official woman named Lena from the State Historical Infrastructure Trust showed up unannounced at Hank's door one afternoon. She was sharp, composed, and clearly furious. "I just came from the preservation office," she said. "We got the alert from Jod, your old friend." She sent in a copy of the demolition footage. Hank invited her in, poured coffee, and laid out the evidence like museum exhibit. Lena didn't speak for a full minute. Then she said this wasn't just illegal, it was arrogant. That bridge was already being considered for inclusion in National Tour program. "We were going to announce it this fall." Hank nodded. "Not anymore." "Oh, it will be," she said, tapping the manila folder in front of her. "But now it'll be in textbooks too." As an example of what not to do, she promised to file formal complaint with the Attorney General's office. Then, without another word, she left with copies of every document and flash drive labeled "Panama Miss Recordings." That flash drive came from Phil, the quietest man on the whole board. Phil was mystery human beige sweater, never spoke unless directly addressed. But he'd been watching and recording. He showed up with a flash drive and Ziploc bag, wide voice low. "I didn't know what to do with these until now." On it were emails, voicemails, even few covert audio recordings. One of them had Keena saying, "If we wait for permits, that old goat will drag it out for months. Just do it. Let him sue. No judge is going to side with bridge over woman improving her community." We listened to that one twice, then Hank laughed, long, slow exhale of victory. "She turned this into narrative war," he said, "and she handed me the ending, but he didn't rush to courtroom. No, that's not how Hank operates. He built it one beam at a time." The court filing expanded to include new charges: document forgery, intimidation, abuse of public trust. A civil complaint became a federal matter, and still Hank never raised his voice. He just kept showing up with more evidence, more witnesses, and looked that said, "I've got all day." And Keena, she began to crack. The host stopped backing her legal bills. The board began to split. Some resigned. Others issued statements distancing themselves from her decisions. Even her closest ally, the treasurer, released an email chain showing Keena bypassed financial protocols and ordered the contractor payment in cash without vote. By the time the local news ran the story, she was already on her third attorney. Brock Lansing disappeared, replaced by someone out of town with suit that actually fit. But it didn't matter. The tide had turned. The public started showing up, not just reporters, but townsfolk. Old men in denim and veterans with ball caps, retired teachers, librarians, churchgoers. They didn't chant or protest. They just stood behind Hank literally. At one point, I counted 16 of them in his living room, all drinking sweet tea and reviewing legal drafts like a TA with subpoena power. One of them, a retired Marine named Russ, shook Hank's hand and said, "You're not just fighting for Bridge, you're fighting for every damn piece of heritage they think they can erase." And that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about Keena anymore. It wasn't even about the HOA. It was about principle, about slow erosion of ownership, the quiet theft of what used to be ours. Not just land, but legacy. Not just wood, but worth. Hank knew it, too. He said to me one night while we sat on the porch, "They think folks like us are done, that we've stepped aside, retired, harmless. But they forgot we remember what it looked like before the forms and fines and fake authority. We remember what community actually meant." Then he leaned back, lit cigar, and said, "And memory, my boy, is weapon sharper than any gavel." As the stars came out and the air cooled over the ruined creek bed, I looked at him, not just as my uncle, not just as man fighting back, but as reminder, warning, and promise. Some bridges may burn, but some men rebuild them stronger, wiser, unbreakable. And when they do, God help the fool who tries to stop them. The courtroom smelled like old wood and older justice. It creaked when you walked, echoed when you whispered, and watched you like 100 invisible eyes in the walls. It was the kind of room where men used to take off their hats out of respect, not policy, where truths were hammered into the floorboards over generations. And that morning, every seat was taken. Folding chairs lined the aisles. People stood against the back wall. Some brought notepads. Some brought coffee. Everyone brought a reason to witness. This wasn't just hearing. It was history under oath. Keena walked in first, flanked by her fourth attorney. A young man with hair cut sharp enough to wound and tie so tight it looked like it was choking him on purpose. She wore powder blue power suit that might have been impressive in different decade, paired with heels that clicked like accusations with every step. She glanced at the crowd, offered brief smile, then turned toward the judge like child waiting to be scolded. Hank entered last. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every step he took was deliberate, calm. The air around him shifted. People straightened in their seats. Even the bailiff nodded. He wore a charcoal gray blazer with leather elbows and carried no briefcase, no entourage, just a folder of fountain pen and the weight of a man who'd carried both bench and burden. He looked not like someone attending court, but someone embodying it. The judge, Meredith Owens, was an old colleague of Hank's. She'd earned her black robe the hard way, and everyone in the room knew it. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She called order with a single knock of her gavel and began. The opening arguments came and went like spring thunder. Keena's attorney tried to frame the demolition as misunderstanding, an unfortunate administrative error. He used phrases like good faith initiative, sincere attempt at beautification, and community enhancement priorities. It was all fluff, polished, and empty. Hank didn't object. He didn't even take notes. He just listened, quietly, like lion letting the gazelle wear itself out. When it was turn, Hank stood, adjusted his cuffs, and said simply, "This isn't about Bridge. It's about arrogance wearing name tag." Then he began. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. First was Mitchell, the contractor who'd operated the bulldozer. He sat stiff in the chair, eyes fixed on spot somewhere in the middle distance. "She said we had to move fast," he testified. "Told us the old man was squatter, showed us work order with the HOA seal, and said the county was on board." Hank didn't interrupt. When it came time to cross-examine, he didn't raise his voice. He just asked, "Did you verify the permit?" Mitchell shook his head. "She said the paperwork was confidential. Said we'd get blacklisted from neighborhood jobs if we asked questions." The court murmured. Judge Owens tapped her gavel. Next came Lena from the State Historical Infrastructure Trust. She carried a stack of records, some older than most of the people in the room. The bridge was officially listed as protected site under state review, she said. It was part of grant program approved less than a week before demolition. She showed photos of the bridge restoration, of kids on field trips, of Hank and other volunteers sanding railings. "This wasn't pile of planks," she said. "It was living history." Keena's attorney tried to challenge her qualifications. She responded with 2 degrees, federal certification, and dry stare that could curdle milk. By the time she was done, the gallery was silent. Then came Phil, nervous mumbling, but with resolve buried in every syllable. He presented emails, recordings. One voicemail played for the court rang out. "Just knock it down. He'll drag us through paperwork hell. I'm not afraid of some..." Judge Keena flinched when she heard her voice. Her attorney objected. Overruled. Hank didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just said, "Let the record reflect Exhibit G. Intentional destruction with foreknowledge of legal protection. And then it was Keena's turn. She took the stand with the confidence of someone who thinks charm counts. In fact, she called it all communication failure. She said she wasn't aware of the bridge's protected status. She claimed she acted in the neighborhood's best interest. Hank approached slowly. Henwood, he said, did you receive letter from me dated March 4th outlining the bridge's historical status? I don't recall. Did you respond with an HOA sticker mark scheduled for removal? That was standard notice. Did you pay contractors in cash? That's not illegal. Did you forge permit using the Parks and Recreation seal? She froze. Did you invent snake infestation to justify the demolition? Objection, her attorney snapped. Withdrawn, Hank said. One final question is Penwell. Do you still believe you were acting in the community's best interest? She hesitated. Yes. I was cleaning up an eyesore. Thank you, Hank said, turning to the judge. The plaintiff rests. The silence was seismic. Then Judge Owens called recess. When she returned 20 minutes later, she didn't read the verdict. She delivered it like scripture. The HOA was liable for destruction of protected property, fraudulent conduct, and unauthorized use of organizational funds. Keena was held personally responsible. Restitution ordered. Rebuilding mandated. Her name submitted to the state board for ethics violation and permanent disqualification from holding any governance role in community organizations. The gavel came down once, then again. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in collective breath. Release of tension held too long. Keena tried to leave through the main door, but was blocked by reporters. She ducked out the side, heels clacking like accusations trailing behind her. Hank walked out onto the courthouse steps like man walking back into his own story. Reporters swarmed. He gave single sentence. Let this remind us that rules mean nothing without respect. And power means without accountability. That night, the neighborhood was quiet, not heavy, not broken, but clean, clear. People left candles by Hank's mailbox, notes, offers to help rebuild. Kids drew pictures of the bridge and chalk on the sidewalk. Something had shifted, not just legally, but spiritually. The air felt lighter, like the fog had finally lifted. And Hank, he sat on the porch with a glass of scotch, looking out toward the dark line where the creek waited for its bridge to return. That's one chapter closed, he said. Now we build the next one, this time with stronger timber. And I believed him, because when a man like Hank builds something, be it bridge, case, or legacy, he doesn't build it to fall. The first plank went in with hollow thud that seemed to echo across the entire valley, not just through the trees or over the creek, but through the neighborhood, the county, and maybe even through time itself. It was early on Saturday morning, sun barely up, dew still clinging to the grass like old secrets, and yet they came. Not because anyone called them, not because there was a flyer or a mandate or a council vote, but because something in their gut told them they should be there. Men in flannel shirts and work boots, women with tool belts and garden gloves, teenagers who once spray-painted fences but now carried drills and buckets. They came because they remembered not just the bridge, but what it stood for, what it had stood for, and what it must stand for again. Hank stood at the edge, blazer swapped for rolled-up sleeves, boots covered in dust, overseeing it all like a foreman who also happened to be a philosopher and a judge. He said little, nodded a lot, offered coffee when he wasn't handing out bolts or guiding beams into place. Every movement, every swing of hammer, every tightening of screw felt like line in collective declaration. We will not be erased. That morning, man named Don, retired Navy, lived 2 streets over, brought massive banner from his garage. The bridge that Justice rebuilt, that read in bold Navy letters with gold trim. Hank looked at it, gave gruff chuckle, and muttered bit on the nose, but he didn't take it down. He left it there fluttering in the breeze like battle flag, and then came the state. First it was preservation officer, then local news crew, then historian, and state senator. By midday it had turned into something Hank would have despised under any other circumstance, ceremony. Lauded not for himself, but for the bridge, for what it now symbolized. The senator gave a speech, stumbling, heartfelt, bit too long, and declared the site state cultural landmark. Plaque was unveiled near the creek. This bridge stands a symbol of justice, resilience, and unity, destroyed by overreach, rebuilt by community. Below that, in smaller print, dedication to Judge Henry Haverson, whose legacy proves that dignity is stronger than demolition. Hank didn't cry, of course not, but he did adjust his collar, look away from the crowd long enough for everyone to pretend not to notice. He hated fuss, hated attention. But in that moment, I think even he understood it wasn't really about him. It was about the idea of him, about the idea of us, of what still could be. The rebuild took months, not because it was complex. It wasn't. The design was simple, almost humble, But every piece, every joint, every hand that touched it was story. Retired carpenter from 2 towns over showed up and refused payment. High school shop classmate custom iron brackets. A widow who never left her house donated her late husband's antique tools to the effort, saying he'd want to help, and slowly, board by board, the bridge returned, not as relic, but as testament. Kina, for her part, disappeared. No HOA meetings, no new rules about bird feeders or grass length. Her house went dark. For sale sign appeared, but never seemed to get realtor's phone number added. Word was she moved in with cousin upstate. A few folks said she was trying to start over somewhere with a name tag that didn't carry weight. But no one really cared. Her name had already been scorched from the minutes, the mailbox, the collective memory, not by decree, but by disinterest. Because when your power is built on paper and pretense, it burns fast, especially under the heat of truth. Hank didn't talk much about the trial after that. He kept the transcript in drawer, not framed, not displayed. Just kept like weapon he hoped he wouldn't need again. He turned down 2 speaking engagements, declined a podcast interview. When asked why, he said simply, the bridge speaks louder than I ever could. But he did take one meeting with the town council. They asked for his advice on how to prevent something like this from happening again. He offered one line. Start by listening to the people who remember what it used to be like when neighbors solved things over coffee, not complaints. They wrote it down. Whether they took it to heart is another story. What I tell you is that something changed in that neighborhood. A man who used to mow his lawn in total silence now waved to kids riding by. A woman who hadn't spoken to her neighbor in 5 years invited her over for pie. The HOA, now purged, restructured, humbled, shifted from enforcer to facilitator. The meetings grew shorter, the newsletters less threatening, the rules human again. And Hank, he did what he always did. Sat on the porch, drank his tea, listened to the creek roll under the new old bridge like it had never stopped. One night we walked that bridge together, the moon high in the air still. He stopped halfway across, leaned on the railing, and said, funny thing about bridges, you can build them out of wood, stone, steel. But the ones that matter, they're built out of memory, out of fight, out of people who refuse to be pushed. Then he reached into his coat and handed me a small envelope. Inside was deed transfer, my name typed neatly, owner of the land, of the bridge, of the legacy. I didn't say anything for a long time. I couldn't. Finally, all I managed was, I'll protect it. He smiled, slow and satisfied. Well, I know you will. And that was it. No speech, no lecture, just trust handed over like baton in race that never really ends, because that's the truth, isn't it? The fight doesn't end. It just changes hands. One day someone's going to knock on your door with clipboard and smile that doesn't reach their eyes. And you'll have to decide, are you going to step aside or are you going to stand? Are you going to let them take what's yours, redefine what's sacred, rewrite what's already been written in sweat and stone? Or will you do what Hank did? Will you sip your tea, hold your ground, and remind them, quietly, firmly, absolutely, that some things are worth fighting for? I hope you will, because the world doesn't need more rules. It needs more bridges and more men willing to rebuild them.